Brilliant. Well, I think no one's joined us in the waiting room there, so we'll get started. Evening, James, and evening, Kevin, there in the chat. Thank you, thanks a million for joining us, Andrew. Or do you prefer Andy?
Either is fine. My wife calls me Jack.
We'll interchange it. Your wife calls you Jack, did you say?
Yeah, she does.
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, we'll go with Jack, seeing as the Titanic's been in the news recently. What was I going to say? So for everyone who's joining us for the first time, for what we like to do with these tastings is get everyone to obviously engage with us. We want to hear questions from you as much as possible, and tasting notes and everything. Andy, Jack, Andrew, do you want to introduce yourself, your role at Loch Lomond, and then maybe give us the order that we're going to be tasting these whiskies in tonight?
Yeah, sure. So I'm head of whiskey at Loch Lomond, but I work on the kind of marketing, strategic, kind of commercial side. So obviously Michael Henry, our master distiller, very much in charge of all the whiskey making. But yeah, so I'm here on behalf of the marketing team and the wider business. In terms of the order, what we've got tonight is we've got 3 12-year-olds and then our 2 golf special editions. So I think it makes sense to bracket all the 12-year-olds together because they have a bit of a thread and a story together. So we'll go for the 12-year-old perfectly balanced, then the Inchmurrin, and then the Inchmoan. And obviously Inchmoan is a peated whiskey, and the open special, which we'll taste next, it is not. So we might need a bit of a water break just to cleanse the palate on that. And then we'll finish with the 22-year-old, the open course collection. So I think we'll try and go through them in that order if that works for everyone.
Perfect. Yeah. If it doesn't work for you folks, please let us know in the chat.
Yeah, good. So I will tell you a little bit about the distillery, but actually I think it's probably worth getting into the first dram as we do that. And the reason for that is we tend to think of the 12-year-old perfectly balanced as our kind of hero whiskey, if you like, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best or indeed the most expensive, but it's the one that talks to our distillery and our signature style probably the most closely, and actually as such it's a really nice whiskey to start a tasting with. So I'll talk a little bit about the whiskey itself and then kind of backtrack a little bit as to how we get to it, if that works. So we call this one the perfectly balanced because it contains all 3 of our signature style elements pretty much in equal measure. So that's this idea of fruit, honey sweetness, and soft smoke. And the other reason why this one is a good one to kick off with is because actually it gives you the signature style almost in order. So when you get the nose right into it, you start to pick up on all that fruit element. So it's very much kind of orchard fruit. For me, certainly like red apple, a little bit of pear. That's certainly what I kind of get off it. And then once it goes in the mouth, that's when you get the sweetness, that kind of honey sweetness from the first fill bourbon. And it kind of gels with that fruit that you get on the nose and starts to sweeten that fruit. And then just at the end, you get that wisp of soft smoke. It's almost like seasoning at the end of the whiskey. And I guess as well, these 3 elements, the fruit, the honey, and the soft smoke, they come from different elements of the production process. So there's actually 4 different spirit styles that make this up from our 2 different still sets. So we've got whiskey from our straight neck stills at a high collection strength and a low collection strength, and then from our pot stills as well, we have an unpeated and highly peated as well. But it's just a touch of that one in the overall makeup. So 4 different spirit styles that combine to make this whiskey. And from a maturation perspective, it's all American oak, but we use a combination of first fill, refill, and recharred bourbon barrels. So actually you've probably got 12 different whiskies almost that create this final result. And as I say, the goal here is for this to be perfectly balanced. So what you get is a very balanced whiskey, very easy drinking, but still with a good deal of complexity, a lot of kind of fruit flavors going in there, a little bit of spice too. And yeah, definitely. And in fact, as Craig's just mentioned in the chat there, a real hit of kind of green apple, that orchard fruit that you get through there. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, and again from Craig's comment in the comments there, is it a spring or an autumn dram? And actually, I have to say, so from a personal perspective, I've got a big range of whiskies, and I like typically big, powerful character on whiskies, but I always have a bottle of this open because, you know, when you don't quite know what you want, it's got a little bit of everything, a little bit of that fruit, the honey, the sweetness, a bit of the soft smoke. It's a great kind of, you know, almost like an everyday dram because it's so easy drinking. And just to kind of like flick back a little bit as you're enjoying the whiskey, or hopefully enjoying it anyway. The distillery as we know it on the site that it is today was set up in the 60s. And at the time, most of the whiskey that was being produced was typically for blending, but also designed to be sold young. So when this distillery was set up, the entire goal of the distillery was to pack as much flavor into the whiskey at the start of the process in order that it could be sold young. And that's essentially the whole ethos of the distillery. So we have these unique straight neck stills, and they create these wonderful kind of fruit flavors. And it's unique in Scotch whisky, as I know it, that to have these straight neck stills. And then the two different collection points give you different kind of fruit flavors in there, but it really packs that into the start of the whiskey. All of the whiskey that we produce has an extra long fermentation. So quite a lot of distilleries will have, you know, a couple of specials where they'll do an extra long fermentation, but ours is 92 hours minimum as standard. So after the first 45 hours, that's when you get the alcohol. And if you continue the fermentation, there's no more alcohol created, but actually it starts making more interesting compounds, flavors, esters in there. And so you get this malolactic or bacterial fermentation that's just about creating flavor. So essentially all of those processes are designed to pack flavor in at the start of the process. And it marries beautifully with bourbon as well. So typically a lot of our maturation is in bourbon. So yeah, and I guess as we've progressed as a distillery, that whole idea of trying to create flavorful whiskies has really come to the fore. And most distilleries will have probably a maximum number of 3 new make spirits, an unpeated, a medium peated, maybe a heavy peat. And actually at our distillery, we have 14 different kinds of new make spirits. So our palate to create flavor in whiskey is actually quite unique and quite different, in fact. So yeah, it's a real kind of artist's palette when it comes to flavor creation. And so Michael's job as the master blender is then to put all that together, get that consistency year on year, but fundamentally create whiskies that are full of flavor, easy drinking, and yeah, and that's where you end up with the perfectly balanced as our kind of core hero whiskey, if you like.
Yeah, it's a really interesting whiskey. I'm trying to think if I've actually had this before, because yeah, it's with a lot of whiskies, not just your one. Obviously, you kind of the entry level core or the kind of the flagship core you can kind of overlook, and then kind of go on to the more interesting releases, especially when you're like a lot of people on this call who maybe drink a lot of different whiskies. But it's incredibly easy drinking. James gets, I'm getting light apple cider vinegar note on the nose, which I think is a good tasting note. As you mentioned, Andrew, the orchard fruits and pears, everything comes through really well. It's almost like a kind of a light Calvados in all the right ways.
Yeah. I love Kevin's note there about the sort of dry cider apple. I definitely get that sort of scrumpy kind of note on it. It's nice. Yeah, it's a good note.
Tart blackberry as well. You definitely do get that tartness. Yeah, no, it's a great tasting note, and it's only 39 pounds as well. This, so it's, you know, it's incredible value, and that's before obviously everyone on here tonight will get their discount as well. So it's a really approachable price point, as well as kind of a flavor style. You obviously mentioned there, Andrew, the kind of the long neck stills and the impact that makes and the reasons behind it. Could you maybe go maybe a bit deeper in on that one in terms of why we get those type of flavors and what's the kind of the bit more on the science, I suppose, behind it, for want of a better word, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So what we have inside the still is a large number of copper plates inside. And essentially what that does is help create reflux in the still. And as it creates reflux, it starts to kind of alter the molecules and compounds that are in the wash and then into the spirit still. So it's essentially that reflux that creates that fruit flavor. But I guess as well, you know, it's probably a naturally fruity style of wash that then goes in as well because of that extra long fermentation. So it's almost like doubling down on those kind of fruit flavors that you get in it. And it's quite interesting, and you know, to be completely transparent, when I first started at Loch Lomond, I didn't know a great deal about the actual spirit setup, but you know, in all walks of life, if I'm ever in a distillery, I always try and see if they'll give me a little bit of white dog just to try it. And you know, variation in white dog is not always massive. It tends to be heavily malt driven, as you'd expect from, you know, a malted barley distillate. And I was quite blown away by the range of flavor that you can get in the white dog at Loch Lomond, and you can start to pick out a lot of the notes that you'll get in some of these whiskies in the white dog. So it's almost like the maturation in the bourbon just enhances and intensifies those fruit flavors that are in the spirit originally. So it's a really it's a really kind of unique attribute actually to be able to get that much flavor into the new make. How tall are the straight neck stills from Kevin there? That's a great point. Do you know, I'm not sure exactly how tall they are, but they're pretty significant because we have a viewing platform which is about halfway up. So they drop down probably 2 floors, I would say. Yeah, they're pretty significant.
Wow, so that probably 18 feet or something, or?
Yeah, I'd say at least that. Yeah, totally. Not quite as big as our continuous still. That's probably about twice the height of the straight necks. But yeah, it's certainly pretty straight.
No, fantastic. And in terms of output from the distillery, what's your kind of production per year? What kind of pressure are these stills put under?
So, well, we have 2 parts to the distillery. We have our grain distillery, which is all the stuff that we do for blending and bulk and that kind of thing. And that's 20 million litres. The malt distillery, which encompasses both what we run through the straight neck and the pot stills and the continuous, is about 5 million litres. And the split in there is about 1 million in the continuous to about 4 through our straight necks and swan neck pot stills. So yeah, it's a pretty sizable output.
And Jamie had asked, where does the term white dog originate from?
That's a good question. I suspect probably some of the other people in the chat might know better than I do. I don't know. It's just a term I've always heard for new make spirit, white dog. Probably because it can be a bit rough sometimes.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, maybe, you know, white hair of the dog or something. I don't know. That's speculation, as you say. I'm sure someone in the chat might actually know.
Totally.
Brilliant. So yeah, as I say, that this one is £39 before the discount's applied, so a very accessible price point. And yeah, they're handsome, tall, straight bottles in a kind of classic style, which I like to see. I'm all for innovation, and you know, quite a progressive dude, but sometimes a more classic bottle shape does it for me. I wonder, is that maybe, you know, to keep the conservative golfer on side, Andrew?
No, just a kind of historical one. And I guess you know, Loch Lomond, certainly the 12-year-olds are competing with a lot of the Glenfiddich of this world, and a lot of that kind of whiskey space is relatively traditional, I would say. So I guess part of it is just about matching some of those category cues and you know, trying to sort of explain the space that we're in. We're doing you know, a reasonable amount in the innovation sphere, which is a bit different. And I don't know, it's maybe too bright, but you can see up there, that's a new release that we're going to be having in a few months. called Steam and Fire, which is a little bit more contemporary. And yeah, so I think we're, certainly for some of the limited editions and special and new releases, moving away a bit from some of the classic space into something a bit more contemporary. But yeah, I mean, and I guess as well, it's a Highland whiskey. It's quite a traditional style. It covers a lot of bases, so it feels right for most of it to sit in that sort of traditional look and feel, if you like. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, brilliant. Will we come on to the Inchmurrin was the next one, wasn't it?
Yeah, sounds like a plan. And actually, obviously I'll speak a little bit about this whiskey, but I'll also speak a bit more about the barrels that we use and the maturation, which is the same for a 12-year-old, but we can do it while we're enjoying dram number 2. So
while we're getting, sorry, Andrew, while we're getting that poured, there's been a few people coming and rejoining a lot in the call. So if anyone's having any issues with hearing us, if that's maybe the reason why, do drop a line, and I can't promise I'll sort it, but I'll try my best. Sorry, back to yourself, Andrew, there.
You're welcome. So a 12-year-old Inchmurrin, and so the previous dram that we had, if you can imagine that perfectly balanced, so you've got the fruit, the honey, and the soft smoke all kind of in a line. And then what we do with our 312s is play with that balance to try and explore a bit more of the signature style and the whiskey making capability. So 12-year-old Inchmurrin, you can tell almost immediately off the nose that it's much more fruit driven. And actually, 12-year-old perfectly balanced, there's 4 different spirit styles in there. This actually only has 1. So this is pretty much the only whiskey in our core range that only comes from the straight neck stills. And actually, it's a high collection point as well. So it's very, very fruit driven. And almost, for me, that nose, you still get the apple, probably more pear, but for me, it's a little bit more candied. If you have the kind of orchard fruit and the crisp green apple in the first one, this one is more almost like pear drops. It's got that kind of candied element to it on the nose. And it definitely feels a little bit lighter as well. And I guess, that's partly because this doesn't have a peated element to it. It's more fruit driven, but certainly feels like a slightly lighter style. And then in the mouth, again, you pick up a lot of that sweetness. Now, for me on this one, actually, some of the honey that you got in 12-year-old perfectly balanced, it's been a little bit replaced, actually. And for me, this one has a slightly more kind of toffee note to it. It's almost like a toffee apple kind of piece. As far as I'm aware, the breakdown of maturation in this is the same, but I get more of the refill coming through on this, that kind of more molassesy toffee kind of note coming through. And probably quite a nice segue into the barrels, actually. But yeah, we use a combination typically in all the whiskies of first fill, refill, and rechar, and they all give us a different element of the sweetness. So first fill, obviously more of that kind of honey, lighter piece, a little bit of cereal sweetness as well. And then refill, much more on that kind of darker molassesy toffee kind of note. And rechar adds a little bit of spice. It does give sweetness as well, but in a slightly different way. And typically when these whiskies are getting put together, it's about trying to find a bit of a balance. When you get onto 18-year-old, which we're not tasting tonight, that is exclusively refill, because it gives you that kind of richness and that kind of throaty sweetness in there as well. But these 3 that you'll try here today, they're a combination of those 3 and slightly different ratios, if you like. But for me, this one feels like it's got a little bit more refill just because of that kind of like toffee apple element of it. And I think as well, just because this one doesn't have that amount of medium peated in it, it doesn't feel like it has quite the same length. It's got a really pleasing length, a really pleasing flavor on the length, but it probably doesn't go on quite as much as the 12-year-old does. All of these 3 whiskies that we'll try in the 12-year-old, they're all 46%, but actually I don't feel like they drink like a sort of slightly higher ABV whiskey. And okay, we're not in the realms of cask strength or anything like that, but highly approachable, very fruit driven, a little bit lighter, a little bit shorter, but lots and lots of kind of flavor complexity in there. Yeah, rabs in there, toffee, caramel, sweet on the palate, definitely. And there's a note there from Kevin about exotic and peachy. I think this definitely starts to get into the more exotic fruit notes. There's probably a little bit of pineapple in there, a bit of cooked pineapple, that kind of thing. So yeah, a slightly broader fruit palette than perhaps 12-year-old Perfectly Balanced from the orchard fruit into the more kind of tropical exotic in there as well.
Yeah, and you still get some of that vanilla as well coming through. It's almost like a burnt sugar creme brulee on the start of the palate, and then the tannins come through a bit differently as well. It's really interesting. Craig has also said a hint of sugar cane, so a little rum edge to it, which is a good taste to note.
James there with the menthol and mint, kind of know what you mean by that. You get that kind of like almost freshness in it, that kind of cut grass piece too. So yeah, I definitely get that actually.
No, 100%. A bit of candy floss as well or something on there.
Yeah, definitely that sort of more confectionery kind of sweetness in there on the fruit.
And Rab in there as well, yeah, with a touch of roasted pineapple in the finish, which is a great taste note. Rab, no, excellent. It's almost like an Irish whiskey, or a more traditional kind of lowland dram than much, definitely compared to the first one anyway.
Yeah, definitely, and it's funny as well. People have their favorites, and everyone has a slightly different taste preference. Dyed-in-the-wool whiskey drinkers, this is often a whiskey that really appeals. It's the same with single grain unpeated, reachable sweetness on it and the fruit, and I think as well it's a whiskey where it's quite easy to pick out flavors. Some whiskies are actually, it's quite hard to really specify what those individual fruit characteristics are or sweetness characteristics. This one I find quite open. It's quite easy to really get into and start to pull out flavors. So it's quite a rewarding whiskey to drink, because you can actually say, well, actually I do get those kind of fruit flavors and I can really pull them out. Even if you're quite an inexperienced whiskey drinker, there's what's in it, understand whiskey and the breadth of it as well. There's a couple more for the roasted pineapple on the finish there as well.
No, so I was just gonna say, and taste the gooseberry for a moment, says Andy, which is a great taste to note. And Kevin says sweeter than I would normally go for, but really pleasant. I agree with the roasted pineapple, as you touched on there, Andrew. No, it's interesting, and £40 as well, so it's again very accessible. You were touching on there, just while anyone has any questions or more comments they want to add in. Adam says, if I has two, I think I'd get diabetes. So but you were saying about the kind of the consumer and the bottle design there as we came onto this. What would be your not necessarily target consumer? We can come onto that more, maybe especially when we go onto the golf. But in terms of your market, what kind of where does Loch Lomond sell a lot? What are key markets for you?
We do. I mean, obviously we do very well in the UK. We've got quite a strong set of markets in Europe as well, particularly Germany. Germany, we do a fair bit in France. Baltics are very strong for us. We've actually got a slightly separate portfolio in the Baltics, which is a bit more to their taste. It's kind of younger, stronger actually. And outside of that, China is a huge one for us. We've probably got a greater share of our business in China than makes sense, if you know what I mean. But the guys over there, to their credit, they really invest in the brand, and the amount of stuff to do over there to so that's a big market for us. Quite a bit Singapore, Taiwan, those kind of markets. But yeah, probably China and UK are our strongest. And then we've got this sort of really good group of markets in Europe as well.
No, excellent. So you're not worried about the housing market collapsing in China?
Well, to be honest, I'm as worried about that as I am as it collapsing in the UK at the moment.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
That's a bit grim. Maybe we'll drink some more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Chin
Uh,
chin, I think. Yeah.
Rabbit said, if I keep a Loch Lomond single grain open as a light dram, or I keep it, not if I, sorry, I added that there by a Freudian slip or something.
Yeah.
Loch Lomond single grain open as a light dram, but I may well move to Inchmurrin, a lovely light dram. James,
Yeah.
my last dram was on a Loch Lomond boat trip. Do you mean your last dram before tonight or your last dram of Loch Lomond? In terms of the distillery location, actually, that's a great segue from that Jamie's introduced us with. Before we maybe come onto the Inchmoan, is could you tell us a bit more about the location of the distillery and you know, do you have a visitor center there? What's the kind of footfall like, that side of things? Because obviously it's an iconic name, like.
So yeah, it is. We're quite unusual distillery. So the original site was a dye works. And so when it was taken over to become the distillery in the 60s, it's not really purpose built, you know, so you can kind of forget the, you know, the heather and the weather, whitewashed walls, purpose built distilleries that, you know, you get up in Islay and the Highlands. This is more industrial for sure. And it's definitely not a beautiful, you know, scenic distillery, but the beauty in Loch Lomond is the kit, you know, the still setup, the way that it produces whiskey. That's the kind of beauty of it. We do some tours, but we don't do public tours. But it's actually, you know, my role prior to this, I looked after Lefroy globally, and I'm a big fan. I'm a big advocate of distillery experiences because, you know, I sort of truly believe that, you know, the deeper you go and the more you get into the kind of home of a brand, the more it becomes relevant and the more interesting I think it is. So, you know, one of the things that we need to do as a distillery is to look at how we bring the public in and how we actually get them to see this incredible kind of like, you know, science and alchemy that we have in this distillery, because, you know, from an engineering perspective, it's a work of art. And we've got to share that with more people. We've got to make it accessible, particularly when it's 20 minutes from Glasgow and on one of the most famous and iconic places in the whole of Scotland. So yeah, it's definitely something that we have to really kind of grow and get more people in so they can come and see what we do, because it's pretty unique. It really is.
And when you're commuting to work, do you take the high road or the low road?
Actually, that's relevant. So I take the high road because it means I skip the M8. But yeah, that was a nice segue. Really, yeah.
Brilliant. And maybe as we start pouring the Inchmurrin and getting it ready, do you want to answer Jamie's question there? Or sorry, David's question. I think Jamie might have already answered. Maybe you want to go into it, Andrew. There, where did the names come from for these two? The Inchmurrin and Inchmoan. Inch is a small stretch of land in Gaelic, isn't it? That's my schooling coming in there.
Yeah. So the question, I think you covered it there. So where do the names come from? I think they're islands in the Loch. That's exactly what they are. There is a little bit more to it in the sense that Inchmoan is actually the island of peat. So historically, that was a place where peat was found and peat was mined from, which is why mined, I don't think you mine peat, but you know, when I dig it up. So that's where that comes from. This dram is heavily peated, so we've called it Inchmoan. Inchmurrin, this is a bit of a test of my my brand knowledge. I think it's actually the island of grass, but it's the closest we could find to kind of, you know, floral, fruity name for one of the islands. So we call it Inchmurrin, but I think it is technically it's grass. But yeah, that's exactly where they come from. Islands in Loch Lomond that have a link back to the flavour profile of the whiskey. There's a remark in from Martin there, not wishing to be a Philistine, but do we cover adding a drop of water to the dram later? So from a personal perspective, and again, you know, this is purely a personal perspective. Pretty much every whiskey I drink, I'll have it neat first, and then try it with a little bit of water, and then see if it opens up and see what you end up with. And that's all about opening up the flavors. It's not about dilution. These are obviously very easy drinking whiskies, so they don't need any kind of dilution from that perspective. and again, absolute personal point of view here. The Inchmurrin is probably worth adding a couple of drops of water to, as is the Inchmoan. You don't get an awful lot more from the perfectly balanced when you add water. You don't get a kind of build on the flavors, but you will get a little bit from the Inchmurrin and the Inchmoan. So please feel free to add in a little bit of water and see how that changes.
So I suppose, as you say there, it's the best thing to do is to experiment with your liking over time. I mean, if people, I mean, I do like adding a bit of water, and as you kind of said, a lot of people don't. But it's your whiskey. There's no, we're not here to force you to drink it a way that you want. If you're buying and engaging with whiskey and enjoying it, do whatever you want with it. That's the important thing to remember. There is no, there's no perfect way to do it.
Definitely.
Reverend Kevin Wright said the Inchmoan is a nice subtle sweet peat, not heavily medicinal, also a bit of saltiness. That is a very polite nudge to come on to the next.
And actually Kevin's spot on this. So just a little bit about the kind of the way this whiskey is made. This uses heavily peated malted barley. There's 3 different spirits in it. There's 2 from the straight neck stills, 1 from the swan neck still. And because it comes from the straight neck still, there's more to this than just peat. The peated levels in this are 50 parts per million, so it's exactly the same as you'll get in a Lafroig or something like that, but the flavor experience you get is completely different. And a couple of reasons for that. One of them is we use Highland peat rather than Islay peat, so obviously you're more on the kind of the wood smoke, the blue smoke, rather than the medicinal iodine that you'll get from the from Islay. But this has definitely got sweetness in it. And part of that is obviously the kind of fruitiness that you'll get in the distillate itself, but also from the maturation. And this is a whiskey which I love giving to people, particularly people who don't think they like smoky whiskies or peaty whiskies, because I think it's a bit of a mind changer. And, although it's heavily peated, it's very, very subtle. It's beautifully balanced. And actually, for me, you get a lot of nice spice coming into this as well. So it's not just about that peat element, the smoky element. It's got that kind of real nice layer of spice. And there's a bit of sweet spice, there's a bit of savory spice. But yeah, it's still very well balanced, even though on the graphic equalizer of fruit, honey, and soft smoke, this has got the soft smoke all the way up to the max at 50 parts per million. So everything in this, all 3 spirits are heavily peated, but the sensation is relatively gentle. You get a good amount of complexity, a nice level of spice, balanced with plenty of that kind of sweetness in there as well. And actually, to be fair, saltiness is not a tasting note I would normally get from this, but I think you're absolutely right on that. I think there is a bit of saltiness. There's that kind of like savory piece. There's almost a salt and pepper in it,
like a brininess to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And Alistair said very nice. Wouldn't have got it 50 ppm as you already mentioned, but I just would like to reiterate that. I mean, I love a peated whiskey, but I would not have had that up here. If someone had said guess, I would have said 15, 20. I presume you're measuring that in the barley before it goes into the still, is it? It's pre distillation ppm.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. 50 parts per million going in, so that will drop during the process, obviously. But yeah, 50 parts going in.
And so Graham said, Inchmoan, very lovely, very malty, demerara. Love the back peaty taste. Miss Ghost says, I adore peaty smoke, but having to work really hard to get over the slight sulfur tinge on the nose. That's interesting. That could be one of those suggestive notes. I hadn't personally got that, but now you've said it, I probably won't be able to unsmell it.
Yeah, you can't unsmell that. Yeah.
Greg said, not a huge peated fan, but this isn't offensive as some can be. Cocktail whiskies. Craig, if any peated whiskey has offended you, you tell me what they said and you let me know what it's out. Steph, you can definitely tell the difference from Islay peat already on the nose. That's actually a good point, because could you, in terms of the provenance of the peated, how does it vary from maybe other distilleries?
Well, I think so. Yeah, I mean the fundamental distinction is Islay peat versus Highland peat, and we buy in our malted barley from the same area that probably quite a lot of distilleries do. So the distinction between distilleries that all buy from the same area is probably similar. The main difference with Isla peat, and I'm sort of trawling back through my memory of Lefroy from previous roles, but the peat is created literally by the breakdown of the coastal vegetation and seaweed. So the essentially that kind of peat that's created comes from different vegetation versus Highland peat. So up in the Highlands, it'll be, you know, heather, grass, that kind of thing, versus kelp, seagrass, that kind of thing. And that's basically the difference. Although it's fundamentally the same process that makes it, the ingredients in your peat are just totally different.
Yeah. No, brilliant.
Just as a Craig's point there, not a huge peated fan, but this isn't offensive, could be a cocktail whiskey. If you do enjoy cocktails and whiskey cocktails, then smoky martini with this is really nice. It's also 2 and you're done for the night, but smoky martini with this, because it's got that little extra sweetness, absolutely beautiful. So just you know, probably maybe half a measure rather than the vermouth in your chilled vodka, absolutely fantastic.
I can definitely see that working. I will see it working in God, my name's it's escaping me now. That the is it a rusty nail with the Drambuie and the big whiskey? Yeah, I can see it being an absolutely smashing cocktail with that. Yeah, might have to try that after this. I'll see if we've any of these tasting packs left and make a cocktail out of each one. That's fantastic.
So I was just going to say one more thing on that whiskey. It's a whiskey that works super well with food, actually. So, you know, I think the 12-year-old perfectly balanced, you know, definitely like a dram for drinking on its own, probably Inchmurrin as well. But, you know, salty crackers, bit of strong cheese with that Inchmoan, absolutely superb. Balances beautifully with a bit of food, actually.
Yeah, and Graham's got a great one in there. He said Inchmurrin with a ginger ale, Angostura bitters, and a wedge of orange is delicious. I can definitely see that working. I must say, whoever and there must be, well, I don't know, but whoever first thought to pair whiskey and ginger, they're probably owed about 18 billion from various whiskey brands.
Totally,
you know.
totally. Yeah, that would have been a good moment around the bar, that one, wouldn't it?
Yeah, oh, totally. Brilliant. And Kevin has said he'll try that later. So this is another 40-pounder, folks, and obviously you'll get 15% off that at the end of the tasting. So as we come on to maybe start easing our way into the next one, which is the Open Special Edition.
Yep.
What was I going to say? Do you want to talk to us about the branding, the kind of image of the is it a stag on the front and that side of things?
Yeah. So that's so the Loch Lomond brand itself is a relatively new brand in terms of, you know, promoting single malt whiskey for Loch Lomond, and the stag emblem was something that the distillery had used prior to the establishment of the brand, as it were. And so it was one of those things where there was a really nice kind of link into Scotland. You know, it's a traditional Scottish emblem. Loch Lomond is an incredibly well-known Scottish place, and the two just kind of sat together really nicely from a brand perspective. Obviously when that emblem was sort of created, they didn't think about some poor marketeer years later trying to create increasingly intricate designs and foiling and things like that on labels. So some of the work that we do on packaging is hindered a little bit by trying to get these beautiful details in the stag, but it is a nice emblem, and it's also one, you know, we're a relatively international brand, and it's something that travels well. So, you know, if you want to kind of show an image of Scotland, Loch Lomond plus stag does a lot of the kind of shortcut hard working for you, actually, particularly in markets like China and things as well.
That's maybe a good segue into kind of talking about this next whiskey, but also referring back to what we were discussing earlier about the kind of open Gulf partnership and the type of consumer that Loch Lomond goes for, because obviously, you know, there can be I must say personally, and I don't, this is not just applied to this brand, this applies to loads of whiskey brands and Irish whiskey brands, particularly as well, that kind of can play on some sort of, I don't want to say cliches, but more kind of traditional emblems, you know, the concept of Loch Lomond in Ireland, it might be the Lakes of Clarny or something, you know, these kind of real, you know, as we say, diddly eye kind of traditional stuff. And it can kind of be, but they're really important brand signifiers for why these things are popular in the first place. Like a stag is so iconic. Loch Lomond is so iconic. And you can almost overlook brands if you're in amongst that and you're kind of looking for the point of difference that is actually maybe a tiny percentage of the market. Whereas from someone coming, you know, from either within the UK, but who doesn't follow whiskey as closely as maybe everyone on this call, or people who are abroad and everything, these are obviously really important brand signifiers. And you kind of talked, was it Glengoyne you mentioned earlier is kind of a similar brand. How do you, in terms of approaching that consumer and the idea of, and how the kind of partnership with the Open started, how did that kind of come about? If you want to maybe while you're maybe explaining that, we can start nosing this next whiskey.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan, actually, and that'll give me an excuse to talk to you a little bit about our philosophy of whiskey making in relation to the Open as well. And actually, just before I get onto that, Adam's popped in a question there about how long has Loch Lomond been open. So there's been a Loch Lomond distillery since 1814. In its current incarnation, at its current site, it was opened in 1966. So the distillery dates from in its current place since 66. But the establishment of the brand has really been, I would say, in the last kind of 15 years. So as a brand, it's pretty new, but we launched a 54 last year. So we've got quite good historical stocks and things like that. And yeah, the kind of the golf and whiskey piece, as the brand was trying to establish itself, it was, we looked for a like-minded partnership. So that means basically finding a good crossover between people that like whiskey and people who like another thing. And golf is actually kind of perfect. It's definitely not as tribal a sport as like football or something like that, but actually, generally speaking, people who are either whiskey aficionados, whiskey drinkers, or whiskey interested, the crossover with golf is pretty amazing. And the whole partnership has grown since then. So this is our 6th year of doing the Open, and it just continues to get better and better for us. And we support Open Golf, the British Open, and that as a brand is actually very international as well. And so when we do special releases like the 2 that we're going to try here, British Open plus whiskey, you take that somewhere to another market and they just get it, they understand it. And then from a whiskey making perspective, this allows us to be a little bit more experimental. So the whiskey that we're drinking just now, we do about 40,000 bottles a year. That's a limited edition. That's a pretty big limited edition, right? But it is a limited edition for this year only. And for the Open Course collection, we're about 4,000 bottles. So it goes into the market, and then it comes, and then it finishes. And from a sort of signature style perspective, we try and keep the elements there, the fruit, the honey, the soft smoke. But what Michael will do is try something a little bit different with each one. So the Open Special Edition, we've got a Rioja Grand Reserva finish on it. It's about, I think it's about 10, 11 months of a finish that we do. There's a question in the comments there. Can you tell us how old the whiskey in the Open Special Edition is? So we have a bit of a range in there, which goes from about 7 to 11 years old. And there's sometimes a small amount of older whiskey in there as well. But although it's a non-age statement whiskey, it's got a reasonable age to it. But the cask finish kind of helps develop some of the flavor that you're maybe not getting from the age as well. That said, as we've kind of discussed earlier in the call, there's a massive pack of flavor that goes into the start of the process. So the maturation isn't necessarily the be all and end all. And what we do from a kind of a whiskey making perspective or finishing perspective is look for something that really complements the base spirit. So it's quite unusual for us to use very heavy finishes, like sort of Oloroso sherry or something like that, because that will tend to mask the flavor of the base spirit rather than enhance it. So things like wine finishes tend to work really well. We've done virgin oak before as well. They tend to work quite well. You get a lot of spice coming through on that. And so we'll try and vary it every year to do something a little bit different. And it allows Michael to be a bit more kind of experimental with finishes as well. But the goal here is about picking something which will really, really enhance the base flavor of the whiskey. And so that's where you get to on the Open Special Edition. This one has a number of different spirit types in it. It's 3 different spirit types in there, from straight neck high collection, straight neck low collection, and then a medium peated straight neck low collection as well. So quite fruit driven, but it does have that kind of smoke element in it as well. And I think for me, the difference on this, when you get the nose right into it, it's definitely floral. You know, the kind of fruit element has changed a bit, and you get a sort of higher kind of, almost like a rose floral, that sort of sweet floral note on it. Still definitely a bit of peach and pear, I think, too.
You do get that. I do agree with Jamie. I obviously made a terrible joke there, but it actually, I agree. Jamie, you get that kind of that varnish, that kind of freshly treated wood in a really good way as well on there, which is really interesting, because it's very hard to get all the flavors you just described there, Andrew, around the kind of fruitiness, and then also get that kind of oakiness as well. That's a kind of a rare match when you get into a kind of when someone you have a good whiskey, you know, because otherwise normally you're either one or the other.
Yeah, totally. No, I think the sort of furniture polish piece, yeah, definitely get that. And for me as well, like you still get fruit, but the kind of Rioja finish, I think, gives it a dryness and a little bit of kind of red berry in there as well in the flavor. So you know, in the previous whiskies that we've tried, the fruit's very much orchard fruit, but with that finish, you start to pick up more of the kind of red berry, definitely a little bit of raspberry as well.
Yeah, I can definitely say, and then that kind of red berry kind of rosiness really picks up. Yeah, once you've tasted it, you get it, and then you get it then when you go back to nose it, whereas you don't get it the other way around, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
It's good. Craig said really get the red wine flavoring coming through. A bit of heather honey. Heather honey is a great taste note, actually. And James has asked a great question, maybe about the ABV, which might come back to in just a second. We'll go through some more tasting notes first. Rabbit said red berries and cream. Kevin said I got red autumn fruit, then vanilla on the tongue. 100%. So maybe while people kind of tease out a few more tasting notes from this is £47, so it's not a huge jump up from what we've tasted so far, as well, despite it being a limited edition. Could you maybe go back onto I mean, obviously the James's question about the ABV as to why they're all at 46%, and then also how this maybe varies from the other edition years, and can you remind us as well, Andrew, how long you've been doing these open editions? Sorry, so there's 3 questions in one there, but if you want to do the ABV first.
Yeah. So ABV, most of our core range is 46%, and the reason for that is at that ABV you don't have to chill filter. So it's literally a kind of functional piece, which means we don't have to chill filter. You know, I'll not pretend to be an expert on chill filtering, you know, and it's questionable as to whether it affects the taste of a whiskey. The one thing I would say is I think it can strip mouthfeel. And, you know, particularly when you drink a whiskey like this, I think this has actually got quite a thick mouthfeel on it. And so if you did it at 40% or 43 or something like that and chill filtered it, you might get some of that stripped back. So we tend to do all of our core range of 46%. We do some at 40, but they tend to be the kind of entry-level supermarket kind of single malts. And so pretty much everything from 12 and up is 46%, and indeed our limited editions. So that's the reason that we do it. I think as well, you know, and again, I don't want this to sound wrong, but I think, you know, the alcohol does, for me, sometimes frame the structure of the whiskey. And I don't think it always has to be high, but getting it right, I think, is important. And I think there's some whiskies that I tried fairly recently, and I wouldn't name them, that really suffered as a result of being slightly below where they should be for the whiskey that they could be, if you know what I mean. So I think having the right level of ABV to hold the whiskey together, to give it a bit of structure, and allow you to get that kind of full experience is quite important. That said, you know, I'm not an advocate for incredibly strong whiskies or anything. It's what's right for that whiskey, in my opinion. There was also a question just further up around colouring.
Yes, I was gonna say we'll come back to that. I had missed that one. So that was a good shout, because when you were talking about ABV there, it reminded me of that. Because do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so all of the whiskies here, with the exception of the 22-year-old, have colouring. The whiskey that we produce tends to be quite light in colour, and because the vast majority of our maturation is in bourbon, you don't tend to get that really deep kind of sherry hue that you might get with a sherry finish or a full maturation in sherry. In a lot of our markets, colour is quite highly prized, particularly in Asia, and China's a very big market for us, so we do add colouring. And it literally, all it is colouring. It's not flavouring, nothing like that. It's just colouring. You know, as a kind of whiskey purist, I'd prefer it if we didn't, but there's a sort of commercial reality to it. And you know, perception is a lot of how people drink. You know, you drink with your eyes, etc. So we do add it. The 22-year-old doesn't have any colouring. That's natural colour. And when you get to the kind of higher ages, typically we don't add it because it doesn't need it. But we'll add a bit to some of these younger whiskies, and the 12-year-old and the 14-year-old, just to kind of help with that sort of perception on it. So yeah, we do. Yeah.
So Martin's asked a question there about how difficult it is to maintain a consistent 46% from the still. So I don't know if you want to go into a bit how getting to that ABV works in terms of still strength, and then casking strength, and then bottling strength.
Yeah, so the whiskey will come off the still. Well, it depends on which cut point that we're taking, but anywhere from sort of 70 to 90. And as it comes off the still, it will then go into cask. As you age your whiskey, the ABV drops. So when you get the angel share and it disappears, there's a disproportionate amount of alcohol that will go with the angel share. So more alcohol than water will evaporate, and as a result, your ABV will drop. And interestingly, when you get to the very high ages, you actually have to watch where your ABVs get to, because if it drops below 40%, it's useless. And that's not what you want on a 50-year-old cask of whiskey.
Useless in the sense that it's no longer legally whiskey. It could still taste lovely.
Yeah, no, absolutely, but still not legally whiskey. Yeah. So what you end up with is a range of strengths of whiskey in cask maturing, not always perfectly consistently. So you could fill two identical casks with the same run of spirit, same strength, and over time you might find that those ABVs are actually different. So in answer to the question, how do you make it consistent? You can't, unless you actually find a way to make it consistent. So all of our whiskies will go through a marrying process, or a vatting process. So once they come out of cask, they'll sit together for usually, depends, between 4 and 8 weeks usually, and that will allow the whiskey to marry. And then as a kind of collective, that will have an ABV, and then you essentially add water to get it to your desired strength. So that's how you do it. You start off with very high ABVs. It will drop over time. It'll marry together, get a consistent ABV, and then you kind of take it back to get to your legally stated ABV, if you like. So that's kind of how you do it. And if you have a cask strength whiskey, that's where you'll see typically slightly more unusual numbers, as we'll see in this next whiskey, which I think is 47.2, I think it is. Or 48.2 perhaps?
48.2.
48.2.
Yeah. No, that's well explained, Andrew. I appreciate that. I hope that that explains it for you, Martin. Jim says, I'm getting a very waxy, creamy texture. I wish the finish was a bit longer lasting. I really enjoy it. Reverend Kevin White says the ABV of these seems to work well. You can add a drop of water if you fancy. There's room for maneuver. Just tried it. It doesn't add much to the spectrum of taste, but they drink well without it. And James got a really good question here, which I've never thought of in my life, but it's one of those things when now that I've thought of it, I'll never unthink of it. So he's always said that, to paraphrase what he's saying, basically saying if you're bottling a whiskey, the youngest whiskey in the that goes into the bottle is the oldest age you're allowed to put in the bottle. But when you add coloring, there's obviously coloring hasn't been cask aged. So why how does that affect? How come that doesn't count? Basically,
the key word is whiskey. And if you think about it, when you dilute to 46%, you're adding water, and that's not 12 years old either.
Yeah.
So the youngest whiskey has to be 12 years old, but not the youngest liquid, I guess.
Yeah, and I personally, maybe when I was younger, and getting into whiskey, I thought it was a crime that people colored whiskey, but now I totally don't care. Once you enjoy the whiskey, that's all that matters. I suppose you mellow with age, just like a whiskey, Andrew. But I suppose I would be in favor of more transparency in terms of like the Germans with the
Farbspiel.
Yeah, there you go. Glad you pronounced it. Do you have any? And not as a representative of Loch Lomond, as somebody who works in industry, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. And from our perspective, we'll never shy away from the fact that we add colouring, because exactly to your point, Luke, it's not a crime. It's down to kind of personal, individual, and market, needs and wants, and lots of people are different. I think as a whiskey purist, I'd rather we didn't. But if the overall enjoyment of whiskey is improved by adding colouring and people being transparent about it, then I think that's probably a good thing. But yeah, and I think having something on the label that says has colouring, it wouldn't be an issue for us as a brand or me as a person. And I think unwrapping and unraveling whiskey and making it welcoming to as many people as possible is the end goal. So a bit of transparency.
You were nearly there, Andrew. The tagline for the whiskey shop is unlocking the mystery.
There you go.
So you were with unwrapping. You were close to unraveling. You were nearly there. You was nearly the perfect answer, on brand.
Nearly on brand. Yeah.
And Jamie's got a great point there. He says water is as old as the hills. I suppose that's true.
Interestingly, Jamie, one of my very good friends works for the British Geological Survey, and he's done numerous studies on Loch Lomond and the surrounding areas. And he offered to come down. So we get all of our water from a borehole. So it's groundwater that comes in from the loch, but it takes a very long time for it to get from the loch to our borehole, even though it's 250 meters or something like that. You're talking years. And he offered to come in and measure the age of our water. And I'm definitely gonna take him up on it at some point and get him to come down and to do it. I'll probably need to swap him a bit of a whiskey tasting for him and his fellow geologists, but I think it'd be absolutely fascinating. And as old as the hills is probably correct, but I think you're certainly looking at several hundred years old in terms of genuine water age, which is fascinating actually. And I'd love to know a little bit more about how that mineralization process works from the loch through the layers and the strata, the time it takes, what minerals it picks up before it comes into our borehole. But mostly because I'm a bit of a nerd like that. I quite like little bits of interesting information that I can drop into tasting. So I'm sure you'd have been very impressed if I'd said the Loch Lomond water has been empirically tested at 106 years old exactly. But I can't say that yet. I will do one day, but I can't say that quite yet.
No, of course. And do you know what type of music he listens to?
No.
Okay. I'm gonna let you fill in the blanks with my bad rock music joke, but
nice.
The Rolling Stones. Reverend Kevin Wright said he's 69 today. Happy birthday!
Happy birthday, Kevin.
Mellowed with age, so happy birthday, Kevin. I'm
glad
you chose to spend it with us.
Your good health.
Exactly. So speaking of age, this next one, we're going back to an age statement at 22. So do you want to maybe give us an introduction to the Open collection 2023, 22-year-olds? Actually, as we're pouring that, you didn't mention how many previous editions there had been of the Open Special.
So we've been doing this for 6 years, and I believe there's 5 previous editions because we had one that was problematic with COVID and didn't happen. So yeah, I think it's 5 editions, and what we do is essentially 2 releases a year, although we've started doing a 3rd single cask as well. So we always have a sort of non-age statement, and then well, it ranges between 19 and sort of 22 years old. And the idea is just to do something a little bit different, and quite often we'll try and mirror what we're doing on the Open Special with what we're doing on the Open course. But this year's a little unusual, actually. So there's no direct linkage between the liquids of the Open Special and the Open course. And the reason that we wanted to do this is because this is quite an unusual whiskey, because it's organic. And what that means is that every part of the process that can be certified organic is. And, you know, the real question on that is, well, how does that affect the flavor of the whiskey? And in some areas, it can be a light touch, you know, so if it's organic malted barley, it might be slightly different, but, you know, that's at the start of the process. Once that runs all the way through, how does that really affect the end flavor of the whiskey? But I think where it really comes into it is the barrels. So we have certified organic barrels. And again, you know, you have to sort of think your way through this one a little bit, but pretty much all oak is organic anyway, right? Because it's not exactly grown on farms with pesticides or anything like that. But it's the spirit that was in that barrel was certified organic as well. So the bourbon barrels that we used on this had an organic bourbon in it. And that will change the flavor of the whiskey, because obviously that's different from your, you know, standard Jack Daniel's, Maker's Mark, Jim Beam, whatever casks you might use. That's a very different whiskey. You know, organic barrels is going to be small batch. That's not commercial scale. So again, you're probably looking at a very different kind of a liquid that went in that. And I think that's probably what you get through on this. You still tend to get, you know, the fruit, the honey, the soft smoke. We're still using straight neck and swan neck stills, but the fruit flavor that comes through, definitely tropical fruit on this one for me. So, you know, that kind of like pineapple, bit of peach, definitely a little bit of ginger on the nose as well. So it started to really change that fruit flavor. And I guess part of that as well is the age of it, you know, 22 years, you start to pick up more wood influence, a bit more spice, definitely like, you know, a little bit more of that kind of tropical fruit coming through as well, which you tend to get the longer you have something in a barrel. And then from a flavor perspective, along with that kind of pineapple sweetness, there's a little tinge of sort of, I don't know, like grapefruit bitterness in there as well. So you're kind of like offsetting a little bit that sweetness with some tartness as well. So yeah, kind of quite different, but the level of spice, the complexity completely changes, but there's a mellowness as well. You've got that kind of smooth roundness on it too. And, you know, that kind of caramelization on the fruits definitely coming through. And then a beautiful spice on the finish too. You know, you start to get that real kind of length coming through, bits of cinnamon, definitely more ginger as well. And the oak, definitely on the oak.
I can't get over how different this is to what we've tried so far. I wouldn't, you know, doing these blind, I would have thought it was totally different liquid from a totally different distillery. You know, this isn't a value judgment, because they're all been tremendous, but it's just incredibly different. There's some really interesting comments coming through. The Alistair, who's, I must say, his tasting setup, I see he's left his seat now. He's back. Is tremendous. I'm very jealous of it. It looks very both outdoorsy and homely at the same time. It's brilliant. He says he's gone through the list of fruits. He said it's gone from red apples to Granny Smiths for me, a bit of pear as well, conference pears coming on strong. Jamie said sweet and cereal notes, liquid orange, chocolate digestive.
I love the chocolate digestive tasting
Yeah.
note. You know, that's that. It definitely has that sort of like cereal sweetness. And to be fair, chocolate is a tasting note I've never been able to pick up, but I know exactly where that's coming from.
Definitely. The Craig said a little bit of mango for me. Reverend Kevin Wright said I got the peach, pineapple, apricot, still with sharp cider apple. That's a callback to a great earlier tasting note as well. On the top there is smoother, much more mature taste on the tongue. Rabbit says much more complex with spice, peppery, but still with the fruit mixed in. And Alice said we were in a motorhome. I had guessed it was something like that, all right, but it looks great. Brilliant. Very jealous.
Yeah.
So yeah. I hope you don't drive it after this, by the way.
Yeah. I love that note from Richard. Initial leather. I definitely understand that. It's still got that kind of like waxy polished kind of piece on it.
Yeah. No, totally. I was going to make a bad joke there, but I won't. Just about the fact that you mean like initial leather is in when leather is initially introduced rather than initially on the whiskey you get leather. I only clarified that joke just in case people's minds are going into the gutter. James says pineapple turnover on the nose, tropical fruit shop. This is like a hot beach holiday in a glass. Craig said, if it's wrong, shoot me. I won't. But would be great sipping under a palm tree in the Caribbean. I don't see there's anything wrong with that at all. Steph, I think anything really, to be honest, would be great to be under a palm tree in the Caribbean.
Totally.
I'll just take a couple of cans of Tennent's. That's much more complex than the previous one, but tastes younger than a 22-year-old. Very pleasant. I can see that maybe that the alcohol coming through more than in the other ones with that slightly higher ABV. And some of those kind of fruity notes that are more associated with kind of maybe younger ex-bourbon cask whiskey, I can see why Seth would say it doesn't taste the 22-year-old. As an observation rather than a criticism, I totally get that. This whiskey is a jump in price point as well. It's £220, but it does mean that the discount as a percentage is the same, but as a number is much bigger. 15% off that, tremendous value. So worth picking up. Remind us again, how many bottles of this were produced, Andrew?
4,000.
4,000.
Globally. Yeah.
And how many in the UK, do you know?
Well, now you're asking. Actually, to be fair, because we will have quite a bit of stock of this at the Open itself, it's probably 600 or 700 bottles, something like that. Yeah.
And on the Isle of Man specifically?
On the Isle of Man.
Yeah. Sorry, that's just a joke. I'm just being. It
is natural color, Andy. Yeah, it is.
Brilliant. No, it's really interesting. So you said obviously 6 years ago, because I asked a really, really long question earlier about your kind of consumer profile and the kind of symbology of the brand. But obviously you mentioned that 6 years ago that you started with the Open. Could you maybe go a bit more? I mean, you did touch on why in terms of the crossover of golf drinkers and stuff. I just want to clarify that I haven't totally forgotten your answer. But just in terms of how that happens, do you go out to tender on a thing? Is there do you approach? Did you start sponsoring something a bit more niche, or because it's as you mentioned yourself, it's a major event in the sporting calendar, both here and even people in the other side of the Atlantic, all around the world tune in. So. Yeah, I mean, how does a company go around ending up something like that? That's not like Adidas or Samsung or some huge brand.
Yeah. So actually, it's quite interesting. So our owner Colin, he's a mad golfer, which is definitely part of it. This stuff is passion projects for him as well. But he's also he's a really ambitious guy, and we did quite a lot of local golf sponsorships. And when we actually signed the deal for the Open, I mean, it was extraordinary jump from, a brand with little or no kind of cut through in the mainstream into sponsoring a really big event in the calendar. So it was a very ambitious project. And actually, our brand is now at a place where you know, if you think about the open in Loch Lomond, you know, that feels like a natural fit. But actually, when we started, you know, the disparity in brand power was pretty massive. So we've really grown with it. But you know, this has come through a passion for whiskey and a passion for golf, and fundamentally, you know, people with real ambition to make a difference on the brand. So yeah, and I must say, I joined after that, so I can't claim any great kind of like strategic vision for this from a personal perspective, but I can definitely tip my hat to the guys that kind of kicked it off, because it's been a wonderful partnership. And you know, the R&A, the guys that own this this property, have been really good working with us, and it's been a very sort of strong partnership that's grown. And we initially signed a 5-year deal, and we've literally just signed another 5 years. So we're gonna carry this on for on and on. And so I was able to break the news to Michael, our master distiller, that he needs to come up with another 4 years worth of special editions and start buying casks for it now. But yeah, it's nice, and you know, the whole business gets behind it, and it's you know, it's a really big deal for us, and a lovely thing to be able to bring customers to. And again, you know, just to speak really personally on this, for sort of like 8 or 9 days, I get to go and speak to people that love whiskey and do tastings with them every 30 minutes for 9 days, and it's just great. And it's so nice to move from sitting in front of a desk talking about whiskey, putting together projects, to actually speaking to people that love whiskey, and that's a really nice thing. So you know, from a personal perspective, it sort of, I don't know, reconnects you with what makes whiskey such an amazing area, because people love it. It's great to talk about it, and you can have great conversations and give people stuff that they really enjoy. And yeah, it's a lovely thing to be able to do.
No, brilliant. That's fantastic. There's two, because you mentioned obviously we're getting the master distiller to come up with new casks and different ideas. Martin had a question earlier about the sourcing of casks, and Craig had I think it was Craig, it said, do the players get a bottle? So do you want to maybe quickly do Craig's one first in terms of the gift Loch Lomond to the players, and then maybe come on to Martin's question about your cask sourcing.
Yeah, so we do some. So we'll do a bit of player tasting in and around the Open, but we have a number of ambassadors as well. And you know, we've worked with Colin Montgomery for quite a long time. We've worked with Lee Westwood, and Iona Stevens as well. And so Iona Stevens has been fantastic. You know, she loves whiskey, and has been just a great ambassador. She's more on the kind of media side of things now, presenting for Sky Sports. But yeah, these guys keep us connected to the golfers, and yeah, we'll happily work with them and create kind of bespoke releases for them and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's been good from that perspective. From a cask perspective, yeah, I mean, you know, we are constantly looking for interesting casks to use in the whiskey making process. And not to give away too many trade secrets, but we've just had a really interesting batch of casks come in. So we've got some Colombian oak and Swedish oak, which is virgin. So not had previous spirit in it, and we're charring them up in our distillery, and we're going to look at what we can then use that for. But again, you know, it's trying to find casks which are going to have a flavor that's sympathetic to our base spirit style. And we've done a couple of releases recently, a single grain and also a Loch Lomond golf single cask in Mizunara. And that is a slow growing oak from Japan, extra thick casks. And it gives you this amazing like sandalwood fragrancy in the whiskey. And it's just beautiful. So you get kind of fruit and honey in the spirit mixed with this fragrance and the sandalwood. It's just fantastic. But I think, you know, certainly Michael and the team are always looking at what could be an interesting oak to finish the whiskey in that isn't necessarily, you know, the Olorosos, the PX, which are lovely. And you know, don't get me wrong, I do like a sherry finish, but it's very potent. And if your spirit is going to get masked by it, it's probably not going to work in the way that you want it to. So yeah, trying to find lots of different kind of sympathetic casks, different finishes, some virgin, some previously used. But yeah, wine tends to work really well, Madeira, and yeah, and some of that virgin oak as well. So yeah.
Adam has said here Colombian oak is quite addictive.
Yeah.
I've actually Swedish oak is something I've never heard before. So that's all sounds absolutely brilliant, Andrew. Very, very interesting. The discount code for tonight, folks, is WS16LLD. I've put it in the group chat there. So obviously Whiskey Shop 16 Loch Lomond Distillery, as if you want to remember it. So obviously get you 50% off all the whiskies we've tried tonight. Now is the point where we want you to tell us which one was your favorite. There's been some great comments coming in also while we were chatting there about the quality of the 22-year-old and it changing every time you go. Alistair said the nose change every time I go to smell it. And Kevin said this dram is worth the cost of the evening's tasting box. It's a real treat. I mean, Reverend Kevin, I think the 12 on its own, the first one was worth the taste, the cost of the night, surely. So yeah, no, that's excellent. So please do let us know what your favorites were, folks. Is there anything and any kind of final questions you want to get in? As we've come to the last whiskey, Andrew, is there anything else you wanted to add yourself?
No, well, only to say thank you. You know, as I say, it's not always stuff that I get to do, and it's really nice to be able to, you know, chat to people who clearly love whiskey with great opinions and great tasting notes. So thank you all very much. I've really, really enjoyed it.
No, brilliant. And the results are coming in. Irlande 12 points. Sorry, that was my Eurovision impression. Craig has gone with the Loch Lomond 22. Kirsty's gone with the perfectly balanced, the first one, as has Martin. So Cephas are very difficult tonight. Strong's for sure, but the rest is quite close. Alice taken into account taking price into account 4 followed by 2. That's really interesting. James says Open 2023 was the best, so that's 4 as well. Gordon says 5. Favorite 22, but out of my price range is Kevin. I'll go for Inchmoan. Inchmurrin for me, says Alex. So I mean, and as people on here who join regularly can attest, it's actually rare that you get such a variety in terms of people's preference, which is a real testament to the quality of all the drams we've tried tonight. So credit to you and all the team at Loch Lomond, Andrew, Jack, Andy. That does it really does. Yeah, it's been a tremendous evening. My point earlier on about the kind of the significance of the Loch Lomond brands and the stag and everything. It wasn't a criticism. It was to say that you know, it can be signifying to one market, but to someone who's local to it, it can obviously seem a bit cliche. But then you actually taste the liquid on a night like this, and you're like, Jesus, I've you know, I don't appreciate how good quality it actually is. Like it's really tremendous. So yeah, it's been brilliant. So yeah, I think that no kind of further questions coming. There's some great comments. It was a great evening. I
love that pretty much every whiskey has had a first place from someone. That's really nice. Really nice.
No, it really is. And yeah, Steve said, this is my first tasting. I found it very interesting. Learned a lot about the different flavors. Thank you. You're very welcome, Steve. Please do join us again. Folks, we do have another whiskey tasting on sale at the moment, which is with Tobermory next Thursday. So there's a few packs left of that. So I mean, they've got a really tough act to follow. But if you haven't already, please do, like, as you maybe yourself, Steve, this is your first tasting. If you're interested, try again. Please do pick up a pack of that. Martin says, sign of age, I've been trying to open bottles without my glasses. Can you increase the font size and the name of the dram? That's good feedback. I'll have a look what we can do. We're as we go into we're not going to have a tasting in August, Martin, but as we go into the back half of the year, we are looking at ways we can improve the tasting experience. Maybe so yeah, we'll definitely bear that in mind. So yeah, thank you everyone else for the kind comments and yeah, been a brilliant night. Hopefully we might have you or one of your colleagues on again, Andrew, to do another tasting. It'd be fantastic. Absolutely. It's been a great night.
Yeah. No, delighted. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. And if there's anything we didn't address tonight, folks, you know what I always say, drop us an email. You can now hear my dogs. That's the time that I really need to get off the call. You can drop us an email and we'll come back if with anything we haven't touched tonight, and we'll see you again soon. And perfect timing with the dog. We'll end the call. So thanks very much, folks. We'll see you later. Goodbye. Cheers, Andrew.
Cheers. Thank you.